Welcome to the next in our Salvation History Discussion Group series. And today we're going to be talking about the central event of human history and the saddest event in human history, the trial, passion, and death of Jesus. Okay, so let's get started. We'll start with the preparation, the days just before the trial. We'll talk about the agony in the garden. Then we'll talk about the trial, such as it was, and the death of Jesus. So let's start here. The washing of the feet. Now, Jesus, the Lord of us all, becomes the servant of us all. And this is perfectly symbolized by the action of washing of the feet, which is recorded in John chapter 13, 1 through 19. Now, washing the feet was a job for the lowest slave in the household. So when you invited friends over, of course, they're wearing sandals. These are not paved streets. Their feet are pretty dirty and pretty stinky. So washing of the feet was part of the hospitality, and it fell to the lowest slave in the household. Now, this gesture is followed by a prediction of the betrayal of Jesus and the prediction of the thrice denial of Jesus by Peter. He will deny him 3 times before the cock crows. And he gives them a new commandment. This, that you should love one another. This is how all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Let's talk about Judas, because of course he plays the heavy throughout this, but I think we need to look at his character just a little bit more. There's a contrast here. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, we have the episode of Jesus being anointed by a woman with expensive uh, oils, and the other apostles are just appalled by this waste of money. Now, you have to understand the authorities need inside information because they don't dare arrest Jesus during the day, not with the crowds around. They'd start a riot. And Jesus hides out at night, so they need someone on the inside. So here we have the episode here. The faithfulness and liberality of the unnamed woman is contrasted with the treachery and greed of Judas. One spends freely, the other grasps at money. Let's talk about the character of Judas. Now, Judas was not different from the other disciples. They were expecting a political Messiah. He plays the heavy, and John, in the Gospel of John, John is particularly bitter about the role that Judas played. But they all expected this political Messiah and a quick restoration of the kingdom. And they equated the kingdom of God with the kingdom of Judah. And they all expected to have high positions in this new kingdom of God. They wanted to make Judah great again. The disciples were personally ambitious. The expectation of the restoration was part of Jewish thought, and that included the disciples. After the crucifixion, there's the story of the apostles on the road to Emmaus, where they say they expected him to restore the kingdom, uh, and how disappointed they were. So Judas's disappointment was the same as the disappointment of all the disciples. And even at the ascension, they ask, "Are you going to restore the kingdom now?" Who have asked to sit at Jesus' right hand and left hand. Well, that means they wanted high offices in the new government, because that's how you determined who had power, who was closest to the king. Who got to sit at his right, who got to sit at his left, and then so on down the line. So they were looking for positions in the new royal cabinet. That's how they saw themselves. And they even argue about who is the greatest. Well, Judas has two things against him. One, he is a revolutionary. He wants instant change. But in that, he was just like all the others. And he is greedy. And greed clouds the judgment. Judas realizes before all the others that Jesus will not restore the kingdom in the sense that they are thinking. So he's playing smart politics. Further, he had no idea that his betrayal would lead to the crucifixion of Jesus. After all, the Sanhedrin had no power to crucify a man. Uh, the worst, he thought, was maybe Jesus would get a flogging, the movement would fall apart, and he'd end up with 30 pieces of silver. Not a bad deal, right? So, the Sanhedrin lacked the power to crucify, so Judas thought that he was just betraying him into some embarrassment, not to death. Talk about Judas and us. We all feel this temptation to seek a political Messiah. We all want a leader who will restore the glory we think we had. And of course, when you're my age, and you knew in the previous period, we all talked about restoring the glory we had back then. So uh, the glory is always in the past. But when we trim our doctrines to fit our ideology, when we subordinate religion to political ambition, we are all in danger of becoming Judases. The new commandment. And this really is the most important commandment. Indeed, in a way, the only commandment. Jesus starts talking about the new commandment after the departure of Judas. And he makes the prediction that he will be glorified. And he will be departing from them. Now, again, you have to imagine the confusion of the disciples, of the apostles. They're expecting this kingdom, and he said he's going. He's leaving. He's told them over and over again that he must die. Okay, but they don't understand that. He's told them that he will rise from the dead, but they don't understand that. But in his place, he gives them a new commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. Now, Judaism, as it was back then, wasn't really about love. It was about obedience, or at best, it was about love displayed through obedience, and obedience to the smallest letter of the law. But here, the sign of that they were disciples is that they love one another. And he predicts the coming of the Paraclete. Now, this is an interesting word. What is a Paraclete? A Paraclete is a lawyer. So he says he's going to send them a lawyer. I don't know. Most of the time, we wouldn't think that's a good thing to send someone. And this Paraclete, this attorney, will be with them always. And he is the Spirit of truth. And he will teach them everything. The ones who love him will keep his commandments. Love, then, is the constant theme throughout this preparation. The agony in the garden. Kind of like this representation, if you can see it, it shows the angels showing him all the things that are about to happen to him. So Jesus enters into this ordeal with perfect knowledge of what is to come. But there is no easy way. Leaving the other disciples in the Gospel of Mark, he takes Peter, James, and John to witness his distress. And he is sorrowful unto death, as you might well imagine he would be, facing the ordeal he has to face. Now, in this passage, he addresses the Father as Abba, and this is usually translated as Father, but it's not. Father in Hebrew is Ab. This is Abba. Abba is the diminutive of father. So it's more like dad or daddy. Okay. He addresses the Father as his dad, his daddy. And he prays that the cup be taken away. That they find another, that his Father, his Abba, finds another way. You have to recall, this is the first temptation that was presented to Jesus by Satan. Fall down and worship me, and I'll give you all the kingdoms. His job was to bring all the kingdoms into the rule of God. Satan promises he can do that instantly. Well, Jesus, of course, refuses the temptation, but it's always there. It's always there. But here he resigns himself to his Father's will. He says, not my will, but thine be done. In the Gospel of Luke, it omits mention of Peter, James, and John. But to strengthen him, an angel appears, and his sweat becomes like drops of blood. Now, this is a real phenomenon, and in cases of extreme anguish, the capillaries leak into the sweat glands, and so the sweat comes out with this reddish tint. But it shows the extreme anxiety as he was in, as we would all be in if we were faced with these circumstances. Okay, let's talk about the arrest and trial of Jesus. And I say trial because there was nothing even vaguely resembling a valid judicial proceeding. So we start with the betrayal, of course. Um, in the Gospel of Matthew, Judas addresses Jesus as rabbi, teacher, and an unnamed disciple draws his sword to cut the ear off one of the Sanhedrin's, the chief priest's servants. Jesus rebukes him. Now, this disciple is acting in the defense of Jesus, but he rebukes him and he says, all who take the sword will perish by the sword. And he says, if he asks, his father would provide him with 12 legions of angels. So, what do you think? 12 legions of angels might cause a little bit of a problem for the Roman general staff. Think about it. General, we keep stabbing these guys, but nothing happens. So Jesus could have avoided this and could have done something another way, but it wouldn't be in accord with the Father's will. He makes a free choice to accept uh, what is in store for him. This, by the way, I want to point out on the sometimes questions of whether we have free will or not come up. I think there's one absolute proof that we have free will, and that is that we can give it away. And I think there's two marvelous examples of this giving away of the free will, because after all, you can't give what you don't have. And the first is with Mary, who, as a little girl of 14, tells the angel, be it done unto me according to your word. She surrenders her will to the word of the angel. And here, Jesus surrenders his will to the will of the Father. The disciples, however, run away, and you can certainly understand their feeling. Now, in front of the Sanhedrin. So here we read in Mark 14, chapter 14, 53 to 65. They're really unable to find any consistent testimony, even using false witnesses. So Caiaphas, the chief priest, in exasperation, just asks him directly, are you the Messiah? Jesus' answer gives Caiaphas grounds for charging blasphemy. And blasphemy in Jewish law is punishable by death. Well, they find him guilty, they beat and spit on Jesus, they mock him, and this is the first of the 4 beatings he will undergo that day. When we come to Peter's thrice denial of Jesus, Peter's kind of the big blowhard of the apostles. He's their leader, but also he's kind of a braggart. As Jesus is being mocked as a prophet, his prophecy is coming true. An ambivalent Peter follows at a distance. He wants to know what's happening, but he doesn't want to get too close. And as he is accused of being one of Jesus's followers, he becomes increasingly agitated as more accusations come his way, and he falls to cursing. And then suddenly the cock crows. And that cock reminds him of the prophecy of Jesus that 3 times Peter would deny him. He goes off weeping, and this weeping is both his repentance and his prayer. Peter actually finally confronts himself, finally confronts his own weaknesses, which he tries to describe as strength. And of course, I'm sure you all have known people or met people who they talk a good game, but when it comes down to it, well, here Peter recognizes what he is. He comes to sort of meet himself through this episode, and without it, I don't think he could have been the leader he turned out to be. In John, both John and Peter follow Jesus, but accused of being a follower, Peter's courage fails. The scene then switches to Jesus before Annas. Now you have to understand, there's actually two chief priests. The real chief priest is Annas. Uh, but the Romans have decreed that the chief priest could only serve for 1 year in office. So they kind of selected a second chief priest to hold the office, but everybody recognized Annas as the real chief priest. So that's why you have Caiaphas and Annas in this. Um, so the scene switches to Jesus before Annas, then returns to Peter. And in John's gospel, we are not told Peter's response. Okay, Jesus before Pilate. Now, why is he before Pilate? He's just been found guilty by the Sanhedrin, but as I said, well, they don't have the power to do what they want to do. Uh, Seeing this in the Gospel of Matthew, Judas repents and hangs himself. This is not what he was expecting. Okay, he thought he was being a smart politician, making a few bucks on the side, but he did not expect this to happen. Now, the charge in front of Pilate, of course, is not that he is the Messiah. Romans don't care. It's that he was making himself a king. Well, Pilate questions him, and uh, Jesus will only say, "You say so," and will make no further answer. He will not defend himself to Pilate. Well, Pilate really doesn't want to get involved in this. This is a local, tribal concern. He's a representative of the empire, and the emperor is above all of these petty local disputes. So he thinks he can get out of it by offering to release a prisoner, which the Bible, the Gospel says it was his custom. Whether it was or not is another question. So he lets the crowd choose, but the crowd says, "Give us Barabbas." Pilate washes his hands of the whole situation because, persuaded by the priests, the crowd chooses Barabbas. Now, Barabbas is a revolutionary and a murderer. Further, Pilate has another problem. His wife has a dream in which she is warned that this man should not be harmed. And so he's got the empire on one side, he's got the Sanhedrin on the other, he's got the crowd, and he's got his wife, and he's caught between all of these forces. But he can find no valid charge against Jesus. So, nevertheless, he washes his hands of the matter. Well, he can't wash his hands. He's the authority. It's only on his authority that Jesus can be executed. He gives in to political pressure. And there is this unfortunate acceptance of responsibility by the crowd in verse 25. Let his blood be upon us and upon our children. This verse serves as the basis for any number of pogroms against the Jews throughout history. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, there's another episode. Pilate tries to foist the case off on Herod because he finds that Jesus is born in Galilee. Well, that's Herod's territory. Herod is the king of Galilee. Herod is the last of the Maccabees, the last of the Hasmonean kings. Okay, so Pilate thinks he can just hand this over to Herod, and then he's out of the picture. Now, Herod is glad to see Jesus because he's heard so much about him, and he wants to see a miracle. Okay, but Jesus won't even talk to him. Now, unfortunately for Pilate, Herod is much too savvy to be drawn into this dispute. Okay? The um, there's nothing in it for him. Pilate has a problem. Herod's not going to solve this problem for him. But neither Pilate nor Herod can find any guilt in Jesus. So he will just have him flogged and released. But the crowd won't have it. Ecce homo. Behold the man. A kingdom not of this world. Priests, the praetorium, and ritual defilement. This is a very interesting thing. Pilate has to run back and forth between the praetorium and then coming outside and talking to the priests. Why? The priests are preparing for the Passover. And if they enter the Roman praetorium, they would be ritually impure. Now, think about this. They are engaged in the act of judicial murder. They are putting an innocent man to death. And what are they worried about? Being ritually impure. Okay. Now, they really make no charges in front of Pilate. They just say they want Jesus dead because he's violated their law. So Pilate has to go in and out of the praetorium. He asked Jesus, "Are you a king?" No, kingship is a theme throughout all of this, but Jesus will only give an ambiguous answer. Pilate is frustrated. He's involved in this, what he considers to be a tribal dispute, and he says, "I am no Jew." But Jesus says his kingdom is not of this world. And so Pilate concludes he's no real threat to the empire. But there's another problem for Pilate. Jesus presents himself as the bearer of truth, and that's a concept Pilate cannot understand. He's an old hand at politics, and for Pilate, words don't have meaning, they don't have truth, they have utility, they have usefulness. Well, the concept of truth doesn't impress him, but neither can he find any guilt in Jesus. He has Jesus scourged, even knowing that he is innocent, and because he hopes this will satisfy the crowd. So he presents Jesus to the crowd as king. He dresses them in purple, and it so happens in the course of the flogging, the soldiers go a little overboard, and they put this crown of thorns on his head. So he's got this crown of thorns on his head. He's been flogged, um, dressed in a purple robe, and presented as a king. The crowd is neither impressed nor placated. He made himself Son of God, they said. Now just think, because a week earlier, he had made his triumphal entrance into Jerusalem, and all the crowd, hailed him as Son of David. 1 week later, they turn on him. "We have no king but Caesar." The crowd pulls the ultimate political threat on Pilate. Pilate asks, "Behold your king." 3 times Pilate has proclaimed Jesus as a king. The chief priests answer for the people, "We have no king but Caesar." All right, the death of the king. Well, it starts with a scourging, and that we've already recounted, but this was part of the process of crucifixion. That was the first thing they did, and the idea was to get the blood not only as an act of torture, but it also got the blood flowing, and actually shortened the time it took to die. But the soldiers went far beyond the regulations in this. If the Shroud of Turin can be credited, and I think it can, they pretty much tore the back off of Jesus. And in crowning him with thorns and dressing him in royal robes, they also reveal him as the suffering servant of Yahweh. This fulfills the prophecy. Now, his title is placed above the cross. You have to understand what's going on there. So really, we depict it as a cross, but that's not actually what it was. So it was a post like this. So there was an upright, and then the crossbeam to which the man was nailed, the prisoner was nailed, was like that. Above that crossbeam, they'd put a pole, and from that pole, they'd hang the charges against the the unfortunate victim. So thief or murderer or whatever it was. But here, the charge is Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. The priests are very, very upset with this, and they say, no, you should say he called himself the King of the Jews. And Pilate only responds, what I have written, and that's it. The crowd mocks Jesus. They want a sign. They want to see Jesus come down from the cross. Even those crucified with him join in the fun, in the Gospel of Matthew at least. But nature laments. Darkness covers the earth. And even Jesus uh, talks about the abandonment by God. My God, he prays, why have you abandoned me? Now, the crowd misunderstands Jesus' prayer there, and they think he's calling on Isaiah um, to bring him down from the cross. Well, at Jesus' death, the veil of the temple splits, removing that separation between the holy place and the people. This was a feature of the Jewish temple. It was a feature of pagan temples as well. So now the veil of the temple is split, and that division is gone. And there's earthquakes, and the dead rise, and people see their dead relatives. The one who proclaims the true identity of Jesus is the centurion. Truly, this was the Son of God. In the Gospel of John, there's a universal proclamation of kingship. And he recounts that the soldiers divide Jesus's clothing among them by casting lots. And this is referred to in Psalm 22. So it's another fulfillment of the prophecies. And at the foot of the cross in John, there are the women along with John. So all of the other disciples have run away, but the mother of Mary um, and Mary Magdalene are at the foot of the cross along with John. Jesus' last act is to commit his mother to John's care. Now you have to understand how important this was. A woman without a husband or without children was in a very bad shape in this society. There was very, very little that she could do. So by committing his mother to John's care, he ensures her welfare, as it were. Then comes the episode of piercing his side with a spear. Um, there's what is the meaning here? The Passover is coming, and so they have to get this whole thing over with very quickly. So first they break the legs of uh, the thieves. Now you have to understand what that means. Here's how crucifixion works. Crucifixion works because you're hanging by your hands, which means you can't breathe. Okay, your chest muscles um, will not allow you to breathe. In order to breathe, you have to raise yourself up. Okay, putting pressure on the nails. Okay, it's extremely painful to take a breath. So you have to raise yourself up and stand on the nail in your foot, as it were. Okay, by breaking the legs, you can no longer stand on the nail in your foot. You can't breathe, and in a few minutes, you'll die of asphyxiation. That's how crucifixion worked. It was slow asphyxiation. But when they came to Jesus, he is already dead, and they verified this by putting a spear into his side. John makes a point of saying that he is an eyewitness to these events. Okay, think about what has happened in these events. Handing over and exclusion. Jesus is handed over from Judas to the Sanhedrin, and from the said Sanhedrin to Pilate, from Pilate to Herod, from Herod back to Pilate, and from Pilate to the crowd, from the crowd to the soldiers. Well, this is exclusion. Jesus is excluded from friendship and community. It's his friends who betrayed him, it's his friends who abandoned him. He's excluded from tribal law. It's the Sanhedrin who represent the tribal law of the Jews that have condemned him. He's condemned by royal law in Herod. He's condemned by imperial law with Pilate. And he's rejected by the democratic consensus when the crowd asks for Barabbas. That is the whole of human polity. So he's outside every human political structure. So his kingdom really is not of this world, and every polity has rejected him. Okay, the burial of Jesus. The body is given to, in the Gospel of Matthew, to Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy disciple of Christ. And he is laid in Joseph's own tomb. Now, the Pharisees seem to have taken the prediction of the resurrection more literally than did the disciples, because they demand that a guard be placed and a seal set on the tomb. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is identified as a distinguished member of the council. Um, and in Mark, Jesus expresses amazement that Jesus is dead, already dead, after only 3 hours, because crucifixions usually took victims usually took 2 or 3 days to die. Um, this really testifies to the beatings he received from the Sanhedrin, from Herod, from the Romans, not to mention the rocks that were thrown at him as he carried the cross. Oh, and the crown of thorns. Okay. we have to really contemplate, and there's no end to the contemplation of what happens in these episodes. Uh, and if this was the end of it, it would be the end of salvation history. But as we know, it's not. Um, and that's what we'll deal with next week. And thank you very much.